Today is Friday, July 13th, and the institutional EC has scheduled an educational workshop for 13 novice study site staff and 3 new EC members. The focus of the entire workshop is on the informed consent process. There are 5 scenarios that the EC Deputy Chair will discuss with the workshop participants. The Deputy Chair, Dr. William Wang, presents the first scenario. The first scenario represents a recent EC application of an influenza treatment clinical trial. The potential participants were recruited from the hospital's emergency department as they turned up for treatment of acute influenza symptoms. The participants were informed about the trial by the ward manager. Those who agreed to participate met the investigator for a full physical examination, took some laboratory tests, and received further information about the trial prior to signing the informed consent form and starting the test treatment. Do you see any problems with this informed consent process? None of the workshop participants showed the slightest interest in responding to the question, so Dr. Wang continued. Well, my dear friends, this scenario is about the duration between conducting the consent interview and signing the informed consent form, the so-called waiting period. The potential participants should have sufficient time to read the informed consent, ask questions, and consult relatives or friends. So the waiting period should normally not be less than a day. In some countries, I have heard that it may take even weeks before the participant is ready to make a decision. In the present scenario, we dealt with a relatively mild disorder, influenza. More importantly is that influenza is an acute disease that may last only 5 days, so the waiting period cannot be too long since the illness would have passed. What we have suggested to the investigator of the current trial was to see that the participants were given enough time to study the consent form, be able to consult a relative or friend, maybe by phone, and then meet the investigator again before deciding whether to participate or not. Note: it is important for EC members not only to study the informed consent form, but also to understand the informed consent process. One important factor of this process is the waiting period. In principle, the waiting period should be long enough to ensure that the potential participants understand all aspects of the consent form. Dr. Wang continues with the second scenario. The first scenario told us that we need to give the potential participant enough time and enough support to be able to reflect and understand the contents of the informed consent form. One important aspect of achieving this objective is to have clear messages in the informed consent form, using layman's language. The consent form should be as short as possible without compromising the understanding of the consent form contents. From time to time, our EC comes across informed consent forms of 15 to 20 pages, using language that only lawyers really understand, written by lawyers for other lawyers and not for the potential participants. Can anyone please tell me how we can avoid such consent forms? Dr. Wang looks around at the workshop participants, and his eyes stop at a young woman with small round spectacles. She fumbles with her glasses and looks at Dr. Wang and answers. Well, first, I suggest that the informed consent be written by the investigator or a person with in-depth knowledge about the protocol and the science behind the trial. And second, I do not think a lawyer should be involved in writing an informed consent form primarily since it is not a legal document, rather a standardized document that will facilitate the process of obtaining consent from the participant. It is always risky that a document becomes technical and long when legal aspects are aimed to be covered.
Dr. Wang looks surprised and continues. Yes, you are absolutely correct. However, it may be a good practice to have some legal advice on the last informed consent version. Also, many phrases in an informed consent form are standard phrases, and that is the reason we have posted many such phrases on our EC's homepage. The length of an informed consent form can be restricted to 3 to 4 pages, which will still allow for the 20 mandatory points listed by the ICH GCP E6 guideline to be appropriately addressed. One additional piece of information: it is better to have a clear consent form covering all aspects of the trial than to have participants dropping out simply because they were not well informed about their responsibilities, treatment regimes, and types of examinations. Note, rule number 1 for the EC in ensuring that the informed consent process will be up to acceptable standards is to make clear that technical and scientific terms should not be included and that the form is kept as short as possible.
So, we can now conclude that the potential participant should be given enough time to reflect on the information about the trial, and that the information should be factual and relatively easy to understand for a layperson. Now, let us address another important aspect of the informed consent process. Dr. Wang continues. Let's address the language to be used in the consent form. As you may all know, many people in our society have an excellent command of English, but the vast majority do not understand or only vaguely understand English. This is the reason that we have to translate the informed consent from English into Chinese, so that all or most of our peers in society can have the possibility of participating in a clinical trial. Do you think it is easy to provide the translation? And who would be the best person to do this? The young woman with the small round spectacles again suggests. The most qualified person must be the investigator. Well, this time, young lady, you may not be fully correct. You see, from our experience, investigators are sometimes poor translators. To my understanding, the best consent form translation can only be provided when 2 certified translators are consulted. One translates from English to Chinese, and the other retranslates from Chinese to English, and thereafter they have a meeting to discuss any differences between the original English and the retranslated English version. In fact, a large portion of EC review meeting discussions are focused on the disparities between the English and the Chinese consent forms, and this can be avoided by using certified translators. Note: a correctly translated informed consent form makes certain that the original informed consent information is correctly presented to non-native English-speaking potential participants. Dear colleagues, now we have set aside a reasonable waiting time for the potential participants to digest a professionally translated, short, and easily understandable informed consent form before deciding whether to participate or not. Do you reckon that we have done enough? Dr. Wang asked the participants. One of the workshop delegates, a young male doctor with a red stethoscope dangling around his neck in a very stylish manner, raises his arm. Well, Dr. Wang, I would just like to know how we can be sure that the potential participants are in fact subject to a fair, informed consent process. I mean, in theory, it may look good on paper, but what about in practice? The risk is that a very busy investigator rushes up to a participant and smartly convinces him or her to participate, without going through the whole consent process, as it has been detailed in the EC application and approved by the EC. The participants may not like to upset the doctor and will therefore not ask any difficult questions, nor refuse participation. Dr. Wang looks content and points his finger to his head. You got it, but you got my name wrong. Dr. Wang, not Dr. Wong. The EC has little or no possibility of ensuring a fair, factual, informed consent process. Can I please have suggestions on how to approach this delicate problem? Dr. Wang sits down in the EC chair at the end of the conference table and stretches his arms over his head. No proposal? I will probably surprise you by stating that I would rather anyone other than the investigator to seek consent from potential participants. This is what I always practice in my own research, since in the past I have made the same mistake myself, i.e., rushing the informed consent process. Today, I always delegate the informed consent process to my research nurse, as she is regarded more as a friend by the potential participants, and they know that they can ask stupid questions that otherwise would not be heard. Note: a staff member of the research team other than the investigator is often more suitable for administering the informed consent process. However, some countries have legally enforced that only qualified physicians can obtain informed consent. Only 10 minutes are left of this workshop, so please ask me 1 or 2 questions in turn, Dr. Wang says. One of the delegates, who was playing with his mobile phone during the entire workshop, wakes up and wonders, what about potential participants who cannot grasp the consent information? They simply do not understand what a test article or what an informed consent is. Can we just skip the informed consent process for those individuals and, without wasting any time, simply enroll them in the trial? Dr. Wang reflects on the question without showing any sign of annoyance. Some individuals never get it, he mutters. When a potential participant is unable to understand the contents of the informed consent, we need to engage a representative for the potential participant in the whole consent process. Children and participants with impaired decision-making capabilities are example of potential participants that need to have a representative, a parent, a relative, or a caretaker, for instance. The informed consent process in such trials should be scrutinized in detail by the EC, so that it is absolutely certain that each participant has a representative that has taken part in the informed consent and subsequently makes the decision to participate or not. Note: for informed consent involving vulnerable potential participants, a representative must be present and must engage in the whole consent process. Finally, Dr. Wang declares, "Time's up. Please sign the workshop participation list, and we will forward a certificate of participation as required for new EC members and inexperienced investigators."